In the animal kingdom, some species have an incredible survival strategy, the ability to freeze themselves to withstand extreme cold. From frogs and fish to insects, these animals enter a frozen state to survive the harshest of winters. They are incredible feats of evolution. So for today's video, we're taking a look at 15 amazing self-freezing animals. Starting with number 15, the mountain stone weta. While New Zealand's mountain stone weta may look a bit freaky, it's also very frost resistant. That's because for at least 5 months of the year, these bugs seem to be frozen solid. And incredibly, up to 85% of its body tissues can freeze without causing any damage. This makes it the world's largest freeze-tolerant insect. Number 14, the gray tree frog. Found across the eastern and central United States and much of Canada, the gray tree frog hibernates throughout the winter by taking refuge, well, in trees. Act like an antifreeze by lowering the melting point of their bodily fluids. And rather strangely, there's even some evidence that these larvae do best in cold temperatures. After all, studies have shown that their survival rates drop during particularly warm winters. Number 12, nematodes. Now, nematodes are microscopic worms that may not look like much, but in 2023 some were found in the Siberian permafrost that had survived for an incredible 46,000 years. They did this by entering a state known as cryptobiosis, that is to say a point where their oxygen consumption and metabolism were reduced to undetectable levels. This allowed them to remain frozen in permafrost without sustaining any damage. As a result, when scientists extracted them from this permafrost and warmed them up, they were able to function as if nothing had ever happened. Number 11, Siberian salamanders. Against all odds, the humble Siberian salamander can thrive thanks to the hot sun and stable temperatures, and their populations can live without any issues. However, in the 1960s and 70s, iguanas began to be brought to Florida from Central and South America as part of the exotic pet trade. Soon, many either escaped or were set free, and the population has since exploded. This is a problem because iguanas are not native to the state, which is relatively cold in relation to where they're from. This has caused the iguanas to adapt by freezing and falling out of trees. Now, while it may sound strange, this is a survival mechanism. You see, when it gets too cold outside, the iguanas, who are not properly adapted to warm temperatures, enter a state of shock. Since iguanas can't generate their own heat, as the surrounding temperatures drop, their internal body temperature drops as well. In order to survive the cold winter, they slow down their blood flow, circulation, and heart rate. This in turn makes them enter a state of shocked paralysis and causes them to fall out of plants, trees, or wherever they may be and onto the ground below. In recent years, these falling found in both northern Canada and Alaska. It's a simple black beetle that's found in forests. However, living so high north isn't easy, and Alaska darkling beetles manage to make it work only thanks to a unique adaptation. You see, in its native range, temperatures can dip as low as -60 degrees Celsius. Yet, despite the low temperature, the beetle is able to keep its internal, watery cell contents from catastrophically freezing. Most cold-dwelling organisms use proteins as antifreeze agents. In many cases, this works. However, in the extreme cold, that doesn't always cut it. And it's here that the Alaska darkling beetle stands apart. That's because it produces a sugar-based antifreeze called xylomonan. With the help of certain oily compounds, xylomonan attaches to the outer cell membrane, and this prevents ice from entering the cell, allowing them to function even if the beetle is frozen itself. Interestingly, there is another Alaskan beetle that has the exact opposite strategy, known as the red flatbark beetle, as low as -150 degrees Celsius. To give you an idea of how impressive this is, the lowest temperature ever recorded on Earth was -89 degrees Celsius. Well, in any case, no matter which beetle you prefer, both seem to have potential human uses. After all, both beetles make use of different antifreezes, and both could potentially be mass-produced to be used for human purposes. The possibilities are pretty varied. After all, these all-natural antifreezes could be used to cool human organs to preserve them, to create a non-toxic de-icing solution for aircraft, a form of concrete that builders can pour in the cold, or be used as an ingredient that would prevent the recrystallization of ice cream after it's been opened. Of course, only time will tell whether or not scientists will find it useful to use these beetles in this way. Number 8, the woolly bear caterpillar. So when you go far up north in the Arctic, there's one thing you won't find much of: bugs. The cold temperatures do a good job of making the whole place pretty inhospitable to these little critters. Solid. First, their heart stops beating, then their guts and blood freeze, and finally the rest of their body follows suit. While this frozen state may seem fatal, the caterpillar survives by producing a cryoprotectant in its tissues. Now, this ensures that while the outside of the caterpillar's cells freeze, the insides don't. To add to that protection, the larvae also use a special type of cocoon to shield themselves, known as a hibernaculum. These cocoons also help to protect the caterpillars from parasites, and while not perfect, they mostly manage to get the job done. Once the spring comes, those that live thaw out. However, even if they do make it into the spring, their journey isn't over. That's because the caterpillar needs to eat a certain amount of food in order to be ready to become a moth. It's because of this that the woolly bear caterpillar moth will often frost and defrost itself for years on end, and by some accounts, they can live to the ripe old age of 14. However, once ready, they ultimately become moths. Yet this time, as a moth is only short-lived. Look at the color of the stripes. Essentially, the darker the stripes, the harsher the weather. Yet the reality is, no matter what you believe in, these caterpillars and the moths they become are absolutely incredible. Moving on to number 7, American alligators. Now, when you think of American alligators, you probably think of the Everglades or Louisiana Bayou. After all, these are the spots where gators spend their days, moving through the swamp to hunt for prey. However, while these places are usually pretty hot, they don't stay that way all year. As a result, American alligators often find themselves frozen in, and they combat this by going into a state being known as brumation. When it's hot out, alligators use the sun and warm weather to regulate themselves. In these types of conditions, they can act as they normally do. Now, this is possible thanks to the prominent ridges that they have on their backs, known as scutes. These are bone plates that act as a sort of heat conductor. These scutes contain blood vessels, and as the sun warms the surface of the skin, the blood running through the scutes is warmed. They do this by creating small holes in the ice, and this is necessary because it allows them to breathe while maintaining a lower body temperature. Once the temps warm up, they will once again enter their normal state. However, they tend to be a bit drowsy for a day or two afterwards. It's also worth mentioning that American alligators are somewhat unique in this ability. You see, if the water drops to 7 degrees Celsius or less, an American crocodile would immediately succumb to the cold and drown. However, the American alligator can survive in these cold temperatures for some time without displaying any signs of discomfort. It's because of this that American alligators have a range that's far more northwards, making it one of the few crocodilians that can survive quite a ways north of the equator. Number 6. Arctic ground squirrels. Mammals are not a prominent fixture on this list. However, the Arctic ground squirrel is a strange exception. That's because from early August till late April, these little critters can reduce their body temperatures from 37 degrees Celsius, reproduce before the beginning of the cycle all over again. In laboratory experiments, it appears that they're able to make this process work thanks to their allocation of heat. You see, while the colons, feet, and bellies of the squirrels drop below 0 degrees Celsius, their necks never grew colder than 0.7 degrees Celsius. This suggests that their brain remains a little warmer than the rest of the body. While this low temperature is still too low for most mammals to survive, this is where the 14-hour sleep phase comes into play. By going from frozen to sleep mode, they can shiver themselves back up to a body temperature of about 36 degrees Celsius. Now, this is crucial for the ground squirrel's survival. Without this shivering, the brains would wither long before spring's arrival. After all, both hibernation and the shivering associated with it devastates the ground squirrel's brain, wilting thousands, if not millions, of vital connections between brain cells. But in the squirrel's case, their brain has evolved impressive resilience, repeatedly renewing itself at an astonishing speed, like a forest erupting through the squirrel's body when they shiver, ensuring that they wake up at the end of hibernation without any damage. However, more studies will have to be conducted to truly understand how this enzyme works. Number 5. Wood frogs. So while little wood frogs may seem pretty unassuming, they can freeze for the winter and live to tell the tale. You see, at the beginning of winter, ice quickly fills the wood frog's abdominal cavity and encases their internal organs. The ice crystals then form between layers of skin and muscle, and their eyes even turn white as their lenses freeze. At the same time, the wood frog's liver produces large amounts of glucose. Now, glucose is a sugary syrup that's flushed into every cell in its body, and this solution is important because it prevents the cells from freezing and binds to the water molecules inside the cells to prevent dehydration. This creates an interesting phenomenon. While the wood frog's body allows ice to form on the outside of its cells and organs, the insides are left untouched. Now this avoids elite. As an example, the Japanese tree frog has a similar ability and is perhaps even hardier than the wood frog. After all, it can survive in temperatures as low as -35 degrees Celsius for up to 120 days. But as you might imagine, scientists have taken note of the wood frog's abilities, and many have worked on ways to help humans to use the wood frog technique. You see, as of now, organ transplants are pretty difficult. With current technologies, transplanted organs must be kept under cold storage. However, their shelf life isn't long. A human heart, for example, can only be preserved for about 4 to 5 hours outside the body. This makes it challenging to transport organs long distances, and in some cases, doctors have to settle for less than ideal tissue matches between donors and recipients. This is where the wood frog comes into play. You see, as of now, we have techniques for freezing single human cells such as sperm, eggs, embryo, and stem cells. However, the problem we face is with complex organs. It's because of this that scientists hope to be able to use the wood frog's freezing technique even when frozen from the outside. This antifreeze expresses itself differently in babies and adults. Babies will remain frozen in their nests during the winter, yet so long as nothing cracks it or tampers with it too much, the turtle will be just fine when temperatures warm up. Meanwhile, adult painted turtles can also hold their own. After all, they can go without oxygen for up to 30 hours at room temperature, and if the temperature drops to 37 degrees, it can hold its breath for up to 4 months at a time. Of course, this posed an interesting question to researchers. How could this turtle freeze without getting frostbite? And how could it exhibit no brain damage even after living for months without oxygen? After 50 international researchers launched a project to find out, they made a shocking discovery: that it's thanks to the turtle's genome, which is not all that different from our own. In a paper published in Genome Biology, the authors found that the painted turtle was using a special gene for freeze tolerance and anoxia tolerance. This gene is present in all human health and well-being. After all, if there is some way for us to change the way we express the genes expressed by the turtles, perhaps we too could make use of some of their superpowers. Number 3. A woolly mammoth. Thousands of years ago, the woolly mammoth went extinct. Until recently, it was believed that this was the end of the story. It simply was not possible to bring one of these creatures back to life. However, it turns out that we may have been mistaken. This is because in 2027, a frozen woolly mammoth may make its way back from extinction. You see, researchers have found that in the wild, freezing temperatures destroy a mammal's tissue. If the tissue is frozen quickly, ice crystals burst the cells from the inside out, effectively destroying them. Meanwhile, if the tissue is frozen slowly, the water is sucked out of the cells, exposing them to toxic concentrations of electrolytes. Yet, in spite of this, plants have been found to have come back to life after being frozen. Foremost, they've been at work finding well-preserved samples of woolly mammoths in Alaska and Siberia. They have then sequenced the woolly mammoth genome alongside the Asian elephant genome. This is important because Asian elephants are the woolly mammoth's closest living ancestor. In fact, they share 99.6% of the same DNA. After identifying important cold weather genes such as shaggy hair, curved tusks, fat deposits, a dome-shaped cranium, and hemoglobin, the hope is to edit the genes and create an embryo. This will then be placed in a surrogate African elephant mother. After all, African elephants are larger, allowing them to handle a large woolly mammoth fetus. If all goes well, this will create a woolly mammoth that is as faithful as possible to the original. Now, the eventual goal of this plan is to create woolly mammoths en masse. The hope is that they would be able to repopulate parts of the Arctic, strengthening local plant life with the help of their migration patterns and dietary habits. The thinking behind this is that apparently restoring ecosystems in the Arctic will reduce the amount of permafrost, and some have said that the money would have been better used on more direct climate change prevention efforts. There are also ethical concerns, of course. After all, if we can simply clone creatures back to life, this may in turn diminish the value of life as a whole, and that's not to mention the fact that the process may lead to a slew of physical issues and deformities in the new animals. However, it is yet to be seen exactly how things are going to work out. Let's keep an eye on this one. Number 2. Tardigrades. Now, when it comes to extreme organisms, few are quite as adaptable as the tardigrade. Now, in terms of size, they are really tiny, at just 0.5 millimeter in length. They're about as large as the period at the end of a sentence. Yet, despite that size, they've managed to spread themselves worldwide. Now, they're known as water bears. They're located in practically every location that has liquid water. That includes oceans, lakes, rivers, and the water film that coats them. Biosis is triggered by one of four things: hot temperatures, freezing, not having enough oxygen, and having too much salt. During this process, a tardigrade slows down its metabolism to a tiny fraction, and it will then expel 95% of the water from its body, retract its head and legs, and curl into a dried-out ball. When this process happens, unique proteins in its cells form a tough cocoon, preventing them from being damaged. When conditions become better, they can reanimate themselves and continue living as it had before. According to studies, a tardigrade's cryptobiosis is so effective it makes it nearly invincible. Be it cosmic radiation, boiling, or the vacuum of space, it's near impossible to deal enough damage to a tardigrade to lead to its demise. It also appears that the tardigrade evolved this ability hundreds of millions of years ago, and in all likeliness this was done to survive some of the Earth's mass extinction events. However, it doesn't mean that the tardigrade is fully immortal. After all, if it spends 24 protein, it allows factor VIII to be stored without the need for refrigeration. In underdeveloped regions during natural disasters or on the battlefield, access to refrigerators and freezers, as well as ample electricity to run it, can be in short supply. So the ability to use tardigrade proteins to fortify factor VIII could easily save lives. The hope is that these same proteins can also be used to help preserve other types of drugs. Even more recently, a study published in the Journal of Nature in October of 2024 found that thousands of tardigrade genes become more active when exposed to radiation. This activity is part of a sophisticated defense system. More specifically, these genes will repair radiation damage on a constant basis, ensuring that tardigrades remain intact. The authors hope that these insights could be harnessed to help protect astronauts from radiation during space missions, clean up nuclear pollution, or improve cancer treatment. Yet whether or not it's going to be possible to translate these tardigrade cell processes to Robert Ettinger publishes The Prospect of Immortality, which proposed the idea that in the right circumstances, humans could be frozen and awoken in the future. Throughout the mid-late to 1960s, this scientific movement picked up steam, and in 1967, the first groundbreaking development occurred. A man by the name of James Bedford became the first person to be cryogenically frozen. While others soon followed, inconsistent freezing techniques led all of the bodies to be compromised. In fact, James Bedford is the only body from the 1960s and 70s that is still frozen today, and even his body has undergone some serious damage. This all led to a shift in the 1980s where cryonic companies started freezing people's heads, but not their bodies. This was based on the idea that our brains could be transplanted, supported by machines, or uploaded to computers in the future. In that time, the practice has increased in pace at a slow but steady one. So far, developments have been made surrounding the freezing of relatively simple organs like human eggs. However, we don't yet have the ability. This is an impossible measuring stick. We simply can't know if this is possible. Therefore, the study of cryonics is completely speculative in nature. In its current form, cryonic preservation is a complex and delicate procedure. After someone has legally passed away, the patient's body must be cooled immediately to preserve brain function. Then the body's blood is replaced with a cryoprotectant solution. This solution is designed to prevent the formation of ice crystals, which could cause irreparable cellular damage. Once this happens, the body is cooled to a temperature of -196 degrees Celsius and stored in a cryogenic chamber filled with liquid nitrogen. The ultimate goal is to preserve the body's tissues in a state of suspended animation, preventing any decomposition and preserving the intricate structure of the brain. Now, while this all may seem well and fine, there's no guarantee that this process protects the body enough to prevent serious decay. Even if it does, the brain is a very complex organ. Not only will revival of it be tricky, but there's a fair chance that it will sustain some damage. There's also no guarantee that the brain will retain the essence of the original person, able to recall their memories, thoughts, and experiences and personality. And there's also some serious ethical questions. Some critics question whether the resources invested in cryonics could be better spent on improving our current medical care and prolonging healthy lifespans. Others argue that we have no right to play God, and that giving people immortality could create a dangerous societal precedent. There is also a fair shot that the people who are woken up will be shadows of their former selves, unable to function as they thought they would have been able to. Of course, like many issues, the practice is still up for debate, and I'm curious to hear your thoughts. Do you think cryogenics should be allowed, or is it something best left for science fiction?